In this video, we'll be covering the second half of section 2.2 on sampling. Let's consider the following example. In 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been president for one term. The magazine, The Literary Digest, predicted that Alf Landon would defeat FDR in that year's election by 57 to 43%. The Digest mailed over 10 million questionnaires to names drawn from lists of automobile and telephone owners, and over 2.3 million people responded. That's a huge sample. Now, at the same time, a young man named George Gallup sampled only 50,000 people and predicted that Roosevelt would win. Now, Gallup's prediction was ridiculed as naive. After all, the Digest had predicted the winner in every election since 1916 and had based its predictions on the largest response to any poll in history. But Roosevelt won with 62% of the vote. The size of the Digest error is staggering. This is a classic example of how bias affects the results of a sample. Biases is the tendency for samples to differ from the corresponding population in some systematic way. So there are some sources of bias. There's selection bias, where we get an undercoverage. So it occurs when the way the sample is selected systematically excludes some part of the population of interest. It may also occur if only volunteers or self-selected individuals are used in a study. Suppose you take a sample by randomly selecting names from the phone book. Some groups will not have the opportunity of being selected. People with unlisted phone numbers usually have high-income families, or they usually are high-income families. People without phone numbers are usually low-income families. So people with only cell phones are usually young adults. So suppose we decide to survey only the students in our statistics class. Why might that cause bias in a survey? Are we giving all groups the opportunity of being selected by doing that? Let's go back to convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is also a source of bias, where it's using an easily available or convenient group to form a sample. Doesn't that sound a lot like only taking a sample of the population by using just the people in the statistics class? The group may not be representative of the population of interest. Results should not be generalized to the population. It can also occur when samples rely entirely on volunteers to be part of the sample, called a voluntary response. So an example would be the surveys in magazines that ask readers to mail in the survey. Other examples are call-in shows, like American Idol. The respondents select themselves to participate in the survey. Another type of source of bias would be measurement or response bias. So this occurs when the method of observation tends to produce values that systematically differ from the true value in some way. Improperly calibrated scales is used to weigh items would be one. A tendency of people not to be completely honest when asked about illegal behavior or unpopular beliefs. Suppose we wanted to survey high school students on drug abuse, and we used a uniformed police officer to interview each student in our sample. Would we get honest answers? appearance or behavior of the person asking the questions can trigger this response bias. So let's say people are asked if they can trust men in mustaches, and the interviewer is a man with a mustache. Another common one is when people are asked if they think that women look better with makeup or without makeup. And if the person asking the question is a woman wearing makeup or not wearing makeup, it can dramatically affect our results. So questions on a survey are worded in a way that tends to influence the response. Is another way that we can get response bias. If you were taking a survey that was worded, do you like disgusting Pepsi or delicious Coca-Cola? Then that would influence the response, that people would want to put the delicious Coca-Cola as opposed to the disgusting Pepsi. Another source of bias is something called non-response bias. The phone rings. You answer, hello. The person says, do you have time for a survey about radio stations? And you hang up. So it occurs when responses are not obtained from all the individuals selected for inclusion in the sample. To minimize non-response bias, it is critical that a serious effort be made to follow up with individuals who did not respond to the initial request for information. People are chosen by the researchers, but refuse to participate. So this is not self-selected. They're choosing to not participate. This is often confused with a voluntary response, so be careful. A sample method cannot be biased. Let's try that again. A sample cannot be biased, but a sampling method can be. And that's important to remember that. Bias is introduced by the way in which a sample is selected, or by the way in which the data is collected from the sample. Increasing the size of the sample, although possibly desirable for other reasons, does nothing to reduce the bias if the method of selecting the sample is flawed, or if the non-response rate remains high. Let's practice identifying a potential source of bias. So here we have our first example. So before the presidential election in 1936, FDR against Republican ALF Landon, the magazine Literary Digest predicted Landon winning the election in a 3-2 victory. So a survey of 2.3 million people. Now George Gallup surveyed only 50,000 people and predicted that Roosevelt would win. The Digest survey came from magazine subscribers, car owners, telephone directories. What kind of bias do you think this was? What was the source of the bias? I want you to think about it, make a decision. So pause the video, make a decision, come back and push play, and let's see if you were right. Here we have an example of undercoverage. Since the Digest survey comes from car owners, people with magazine subscriptions, and etc., the people selected were mostly from high-income families, and thus mostly Republicans. Now there's some other answers that could be possible here, but this is one of the big ones. Let's look at our next example. So suppose that you want to estimate the total amount of money spent by students on textbooks each semester at a local college. You collect register receipts for students as they leave the bookstore during lunch one day. What kind of source of bias is potentially here? Convenient sampling. It's an easy way to collect data. Or undercoverage, because students who buy books from online bookstores are going to be excluded in this sampling. Let's look at another example. So to find the average value of a home in Plano, one averages the price of homes that are listed for sale with a realtor. So what would be a potential source of bias here? So go ahead and push pause, formulate a decision, and when you think you have the right answer, come on back and push play and let's see if you're right. So here, one of the big potential sources of bias is undercoverage, because it leaves out homes that are not for sale or homes that are listed with different realtors. Now there's other answers that are possible. For example, you could have selection bias, because what if the realtor only dealt with high value homes, that they were a high value specialty realtor? That would definitely change our information and change our responses. So again, really quick, I just want to reiterate that a sample cannot be biased, but a sampling method can be.